All right, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Yes, all right. Thank you so much for being here. Happy Thursday. Welcome to the University Club at the University of Victoria. My name's Will Greaves. It's really a pleasure to see all of the real people I've just been thinking about on paper for weeks and weeks now. We're about to get started, and so to begin our day, it's my privilege to invite up to the podium two elders from our local community, Doug and Kathy, to say a few words to start us off. Please.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Doug LaFortune. I'm an artist. I guess I'm semi-retired. I'm a now elder in training with my girlfriend here, Kathy. And we've been doing it for, I don't know how long now, 5 years, maybe more. And we really enjoy it. We really enjoy coming to these things. Mainly because our background, there wasn't much education. You know, our education was raising a family very young. We were very young when we got married 50 years ago. So we, my education was carving and being an artist and trying to pay the bills. So to be here is, we consider it a real privilege. It's the last place I ever thought we'd be in this time of our lives. But when we do these occasions like this, when we have meetings with people, our people generally, a long time ago when people used to come into our territories, they'd come in canoes and they'd be come in, and depending on what they were doing, how they were, you know, they'd usually sing when they come into our territory, and they'd sing welcoming songs and things like that, or they'd sometimes come, you know, with bad things in their mind, being war and stuff like that, eh? So when they'd come into the territory, they'd have one speaker stand up in the canoe, and he'd raise his hands like this, both hands out like this, and that would mean he has no weapons. And then he'd ask permission to come ashore, and, you know, they'd come ashore, and they came in peace, and they just wanted to stay overnight or whatever on their way to wherever they were going. And our people would always, if they came in peace, we'd say, yes, you can come in, and, you know, we'll feed you and give you a place to sleep. And but we only have one thing that we asked. It was when you come into our, because we lived in longhouses back then, you know, we had 3 or 4 families in a big house. They call them big houses now, but families lived in those houses at the time. Down below here, actually, in Cadbro Bay, there was a village there with like hundreds of houses there where people lived, eh? And so they'd ask, just, you can come into our house, you're welcome, but leave all your troubles on the outside. Don't bring them in, you know, and you're welcome. We'll feed you, we'll give you a place to rest and celebrate with you, and you're welcome. So I'd like to welcome you here, Laquaman, song He's a Esquimalt, Wasanich. We're from Wasanich. We're Sayut band members, and we'd like to welcome you here, and thank you for coming. Now I think my girlfriend is going to say a prayer or something.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us today. Like Doug says, you know, we really feel honored to be invited to the University of Victoria in the first place. There's such a wonderful place to be. We are elders in residence at the First People's House here. Such a beautiful building. But as we move forward through the day, I want to raise my hands to our Creator. Raise my hands to Creator, thanking Him for bringing each and every one of you here in a safe way. To enjoy your day together, to share conversation, to lift each other up, to better this world, We are all here to look after this world, to make sure what we have here today, what we've lost in the past, we can recreate, hopefully, for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren who are coming behind us. This is very important. We look to the 7 generations in our own way. Our ancestors looked forward to the 7 generations to make sure we could be here today, and for that I'm really thankful to be standing here with you today. And I raise my hands to Creator today. Thank you for bringing all these people together to share in a good heart, a good mind, a good conversation. And as they move forward in their day, put your hands upon them in safety to guide them through so they can create a good conversations and have a happy space and share a wonderful meal together. For this I thank you, Creator. Hajka, hajka, klako, klako. Thank you.
All right, so a few minutes behind schedule, but that's true to form, so I'm feeling good. Good morning, everyone, colleagues, friends, students, and visitors. Thank you for joining us for the Pacific Climate Security Conference and Career Development Workshop. On behalf of the University of Victoria, my colleagues on the organizing team, and myself, we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Thank you to Doug and Kathy for their welcome this morning, and for inspiring us to begin this event in a good way, in healthy relationship with the land, and with gratitude and appreciation to those who have come before us, whose stewardship of these magnificent lands we remain indebted to today. We're thrilled that you are here today and look forward with great anticipation to the conversations and learning to come. Before we begin, a few logistical notes. The University Club, where we are at the moment, is our home base for today and those of you who will be returning tomorrow. Refreshments and lunch will be served in the Wild Rose Room, which is directly behind you, and washrooms are located down the halls. I believe the men's is to my right and the women's is down that corridor to the left. If necessary, emergency exits are also located down those hallways or out of the terrace doors, which you can see around the room. We're not anticipating any emergencies, but in the spirit of our topic, it seems better to be prepared. So we're here to discuss a subject that looms large on the horizon of our times: the relationships between human interference in Earth's climate system, what we often call simply climate change, and security, understood as the survival and fundamental well-being of valued social objects, including the security of people, human security, states, national security, and the human species and global civilization we now inhabit, global or ecological security. In the materials for this conference, we've been careful to specify that we wish to discuss climate change and security broadly defined. We believe that taking a broad approach to this area of study is vital. Early research on climate and security examined the links between environmental changes, particularly resource scarcity and violent armed conflict, and such work remains a critical part of this field. But there is so much more encompassed by our contemporary understandings of both of these key concepts. Climate change encompasses the acute loss of vital resources, but also long-term ecological changes that affect the myriad natural systems on which human beings, communities, and vast economic sectors depend. Climate change means extreme weather events, natural disasters, and environmental catastrophes, with commensurate effects, again, on individuals, communities, economies, and whole societies. Climate change means novel technologies, new fuel for old grievances, and people forced to move from their homes. Climate change means biodiversity loss, a new geological era often termed the Anthropocene, and the erosion of what renowned climate scholar Johan Rockström and colleagues call a safe operating space for humanity. Climate change means the end of some worlds and the emergence of others whose characters are yet to be determined. While our eyes look outward to the global horizon, we also wish to look down, so to speak, at points nearer to home and the ground beneath our own feet. The Pacific Climate Security Conference aims to provide both a high-level survey of global and regional issues related to climate and security, and to explore some of the intersections of climate change in this region of Western North America. Doing so brings into focus a host of urgent challenges, many of which have become familiar to us here in British Columbia and along the entire West Coast, including words that not long ago may have been unfamiliar: heat domes, atmospheric rivers, as well as more familiar terms like drought, desertification, invasive species, wildfires, floods, and sea level rise. Conversely, there are opportunities, or more modestly or grandiosely, depending on one's point of view, grounds for hope in the efforts being taken by communities, municipalities, and higher orders of government to address climate-related dangers. These span investments in carbon emissions reduction, electrification, and the much-anticipated renewable energy transition. They include changes in how we design and build our towns and cities, commute to work, access services, and recreate with friends and family. They encompass quotidian programs to plant trees, capture stormwater, promote heat pumps, build bike lanes, and harden urban infrastructure against future disruption. Many of them undertaken by municipal governments unaccustomed to being caught up in discussions of security or survival. It's not typically municipal governments that we turn to address security problems, but they are in many ways the first line of governance in the climate crisis, and their importance will only increase as this century unfolds. I say we should give cities a chance, as climate change has not long been taken seriously as an issue of human, national, or global security by security and defense planners and policymakers at higher levels of government either. The 2008 Canada First Defence Strategy, for example, doesn't mention climate change at all, except for one vague reference to, quote, changing weather patterns in the Arctic. The 2017 defense strategy, called Strong, Secure, and Engaged, released by the current government, does specify that climate change must be considered through a security lens, but doesn't go much further in actually incorporating it into its analysis, stressing only two implications of climate change for security. First, that climate change will aggravate international vulnerabilities, such as weak state governance, worsen critical resource scarcities, and generate humanitarian crises that destabilize their surrounding regions and produce demands for external intervention. Second, that a rapidly warming Arctic will face safety and security challenges requiring increased capacity for activities like search and rescue, and the need to defend against hostile foreign activities. Though important, issues of climate insecurity in the Global South and in Northern Canada do not capture the full scope of challenges and threats associated with a destabilized climate. There are indications, however, that this narrow perspective is changing. A 2021 analysis by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, called CSIS, that was leaked to the media, lists 10, quotes, climate security factors in Canada across a wide variety of dimensions: Arctic, border, coastal, domestic, energy, health, food, and water security are all listed, as well as financial capacity to adapt to climate impacts, and what the report calls security accelerants, which is akin to the concept of climate change as a threat multiplier for existing security challenges that's employed by actors like the United States military. In that report, CSIS summarizes that, quote, put simply, climate change compounds all other known human security issues and serves as an accelerant towards negative security outcomes. There will be no single moment where this threat will crystallize and reveal itself, for it is already underway and will incrementally build across decades to come, end quote. Though not yet reflected in policy, this assessment suggests an increasingly sophisticated government engagement with the security dimensions of climate change. Canada has also sponsored the establishment of a newly opened NATO Climate and Security Centre of Excellence called CASCO, based in Montreal, which is expected to help coordinate improved climate and security planning, assessing operational impacts, and developing best practices to reduce the GHG emissions of NATO allied militaries. There is work underway to develop new research agendas and new university programs, new professional training and certification regimes, and to establish new voluntary groups to link academia, policymakers, the armed forces, and civil society, such as the Climate Security Association of Canada, established last year by several of us in this room. Nevertheless, overall, there's been limited action towards addressing climate change as a security issue in Canada, and insufficient public awareness of the urgency of climate-related insecurities or the need for greater action to address the causes of the climate crisis through mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and adaptation to the impacts of climate change already upon us or unavoidably set in motion. It is the advancement of these goals of informing better public policy and promoting more robust public dialogue of the links between climate change and security to which this conference is committed. This event would not be possible without support from several partner organizations and funding agencies. On behalf of myself and my co-organizers, Dr. Sarah Sharma, who I've lost sight of, she's right in front of me, and Ali Tichenko in the back corner. We acknowledge the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Department of Political Science, and the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions here at the University of Victoria, the Climate Security Association of Canada, and 3 research networks funded by the Department of National Defence Mobilizing Insights in Defence and Security program called MINDS, the Canadian Defence and Security Network, the North American and Arctic Defence and Security Network, and the Réseau d'Analyse Stratégique. We could not hold this event without their assistance and are grateful for their support. We are also thrilled to welcome the inaugural cohort of the CSAC-ACSC Research Fellows in Climate Change and Security, seated right here, a new initiative of the Climate Security Association of Canada, whose goal is to identify and support emerging scholars and early career practitioners in this field so that their work and their insights can contribute to a more secure and sustainable future. In sum, thank you all for being here, and for your interest in supporting this vital field of scholarship and practice, and for some of you for coming all this way. It's wonderful to be having this event here at home at the University of Victoria. The best time for these conversations about climate and security may well have been 40 years ago, but the second best time is now, and we're grateful to you all for being here to contribute. Without further ado, we have our opening panel on climate and security in a changing world order scheduled to begin right now. That is timing, folks. I invite the panel to come to the dais and wish you all a stimulating and sobering conference. Thank you so much for being here. Give you the floor? Great.
Let me talk to Will. Oh, on the computer. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, I can do that for you. I can do that for you. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. All right. Well, good morning, everybody, once again. My name is Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Sharma. I'm at the University of Victoria as well. I won't get too much into my background, but it's such a joy to be here today. It's such a joy to be here with students as well. And yeah, I'm thrilled that we can bring everyone here today. The panel title that we're talking about this morning, first of all, is Climate and Security in a Changing World Order. So it's a big picture conversation around what we are doing here, kicking off our conversations around like what is the state of affairs, and I'm really looking forward to our discussions. So we have 4 presenters. I'd like to first introduce Dr. Heidi Hart, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine. From 2021 to 2022, she was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow. I'm not going to read out the acronym. I mean, there's too many acronyms probably in this room altogether. In the State Department at the NATO desk for a U.S. Senator and a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. She's the author of 2 books, NATO's Lessons in Crisis, Institutional Memory in International Organization and the Time to React, the Efficiency of International Organizations in Crisis Response at Oxford. Her research examines knowledge, learning, and change in international organizations, particularly NATO, the EU, and the OSCE, as well as transatlantic and European security issues. Specific areas of interest include elite decision-making, multilateral military operations, collective defense operations, climate security and gender, like the WPS agenda and DEI. Her scholarship also appears in the Journal of Politics, European Journal of International Relations, Review of International Organizations, along with other journals, books, and venues. She's interviewed more than 300 political and military elites, and her research has been funded by NSF, Fulbright, the Carnegie Foundation, APSA, NATO, the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, and the University of California, Irvine. All right. Scott, you have a bit of a shorter bio, not because of lack of acronyms, but brevity, I'm assuming. Thanks. Dr. Scott Watson is Associate Professor and Department Chair of Political Science at the University of Victoria. He received his BA History and MA Political Science from the University of Waterloo and his PhD from the University of British Columbia. He joined the University of Victoria in 2006. His research interests have centered on the construction of security threats and conditions of, in quotes, national insecurity, particularly in the realm of migration, as well as the role various actors play in these processes. He has published 2 monographs, The Securitization of Humanitarian Migration at Routledge, and International Order and the Politics of Disaster, also at Routledge. His current research interests include reconceptualizing human security as a process of securitization, mapping the relationship of mass media to the construction of insecurity, and exploring how private insecurity corporations support and subvert status discourses of danger in the realm of migration and contagious disease. Third, Dr. Bruno Charbonneau is a professor and director of the Center for Security and Crisis Governance at the Royal Military College Saint-Jean, Canada, founding president of the Climate Security Association of Canada, founding director of the Centre Franco-Pays of the Raoul Dandurand Chair at the Université du Québec à Montréal, and deputy editor of the Canadian Military Journal. He is team leader of the NATO Research Task Group, SAS-182, on the effects of climate change on security. His work examines the international politics of conflict management, with a particular expertise in the links between armed conflict, counterinsurgency, and climate change in the West African Sahel. He is currently developing a climate security decision-making mechanism for Dr. Elizabeth Chalecki is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, a research fellow in environmental change and security program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and a research chair with Fulbright Canada. Her expertise lies in the areas of climate change and security, international environmental policy, and the intersection of science and technology in IR. Dr. Chalecki has authored groundbreaking research on geoengineering and just war, and has published over 25 books, articles, and book chapters on diverse topics such as climate change and Arctic security, environmental terrorism, climate change and international law, public perceptions of environmental issues, and water in outer space. She also serves as an environmental security subject matter for NATO. So, obviously we have quite the distinguished and interesting panel this morning. Dr. Heidi Hart is going to begin. We all have we say 15 minutes, I'd like to highlight 10 to 15 minutes. I'll give everyone, if we say 15 minutes, we're going 20. So let's say 10 and we go 15, okay? So I'll give everyone a 5-minute warning, a 2-minute warning, and a wrap-up warning, okay?
Great, and do you mind going back? Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Professor Heidi Hart, and I'm coming from the University of California, Irvine. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you some preliminary findings from some research that my co-author, Jackie Burns, also at the University of California, Irvine, and I have been doing. So at this point, just in terms of the paper, we're still coding some of the results. So again, just emphasizing that these are preliminary. NATO is a little bit late to the game, I would say, in terms of thinking about climate security. Recent research that was looking at how different international organizations are adapting found that among all of the kind of leading international organizations that are out there, NATO has done the least in terms of progress on adapting in terms of climate security issues. Nevertheless, we know that folks at NATO have been thinking about these types of issues since as early as 1969. It's just that it wasn't until 2021 that we finally saw a NATO climate change and security action plan, really giving the organization some sort of teeth to allow it to start to really make some substantive progress in terms of change. This image that you're looking at here, I don't know if it's probably not so easy for those of y'all, you in the back to be able to see, but it says this helicopter, this Merlin HC-3 helicopter was definitely not designed to operate in extreme temperatures of Afghanistan. You can think of Afghanistan as kind of a case study for where a lot of climate security issues came up and really hit NATO pretty hard in the face. So things such as, helicopters, other equipment being, delivered, and, massive investments being put into these things. These are, in some cases, millions of dollars worth of equipment showing up in Afghanistan, and then within 3 days, suddenly the helicopter doesn't work. Why is that? Because early on, folks are not necessarily thinking about extreme temperatures and the ways in which some of these climate security has really come to the forefront in impacting not just rising sea levels, forest fires that we think about with affecting training, but also having very specific impacts on the effectiveness of operations. So do you mind turning to the next one? So why does adaptation matter to an organization like NATO? So NATO, I always emphasize, is a political military organization. It's not just a military alliance that I think some of us are familiar with. Ultimately, it poses an existential threat to the organization. In terms of real concrete implications, this is an image here that you're seeing of some of the flooding that NATO is experiencing here in Norfolk. So NATO has kind of two big headquarters. It's got headquarters out in Brussels, its political headquarters. It's also got its headquarters in Mons, its military headquarters, and then it also has pretty significant presence in Norfolk, Virginia, in the United States. And unfortunately, we're seeing that these rising sea levels are affecting the base itself. And one thing that NATO is struggling with is that NATO has not necessarily thought strategically about making sure that the bases and the infrastructure and all of the assets, sometimes equipment that's sitting there with weapons itself on these rising sea levels are really at risk. So it's a very concrete survival issue from if we think about from the perspective of organizational theory. There's also clear security consequences. I won't go into details. We could think of lots of these, first order effects, second order effects, increased issues with migration, with conflicts that now are going to lead to countries across the alliance having to struggle with these issues. I think we just heard in the previous presentation, Professor Greaves was talking about how now we're going to have issues with the militaries increasingly becoming humanitarian response organizations, right? And having to deal with, responding to wildfires and, real all sorts of extreme climate responses that maybe the military wasn't initially designed for, right? And then what is the trade-off of that for maintaining what's considered the military readiness of our troops? There's also interoperability problems, which is something that NATO really needs to think about, because if NATO is supposed to be this political military organization of 31 different countries, a lot of times in the operations that we're talking about, even though Afghanistan has obviously ended, there's still Iraq, there's Kosovo, and this requires countries, as they're starting to develop and even require militaries to have these pretty strict carbon emissions, and specific environmental standards. The problem is that some militaries may be going in certain directions and adopting certain types of sustainable technologies, but other militaries are not, and they're happening at different paces. So, quick example, let's say you've got an operation that's going to be, and you've got the UK military, the British military, that's going to be using, plug-in vehicles, but then you're, say, operating in an environment that actually doesn't have, any place to plug in. That can be a real problem, right? So, modular nuclear reactors, there's all sorts of different ways that these technologies are developing. But for NATO, this is also an issue because they're not necessarily talking to each other and making sure that those developments in sustainable technologies are happening in the same direction. Okay. So in this, broader project that we're thinking about, we came into this this question of kind of how is NATO adapting and why is it adapting in the ways that it is. Sort of being pessimistic about the whole thing because unfortunately, NATO is really, it's an organization that has not put environmental needs, say, at the top of its priority list early on, and that's just the nature of what it is, right? It really is a political military organization. So we didn't expect to see much in terms of adaptation, but we were very interested in the fact that some adaptation has occurred and wanted to understand why we're seeing adaptation in different ways. So what we've kind of seen so far, and again, with a huge disclaimer, especially now having worked for the State Department on the NATO desk and recognizing, obviously, there's a lot of things that are happening under the hood, so to speak, that we're not privy to. But as scholars, looking at things from the outside, we see these high-level statements, we see these action plans. Now we've got a progress report, methodology reports, but we don't really understand sort of the variation, right, in terms of what's happening. So our research question was, why has NATO adapted to climate change in specific issue areas relative to others? So there are some studies out there that have, certainly thought about climate change, but we have yet, and please tell me because many of you are the experts here, we haven't seen something that's asked this specific question. So we decided how are we going to operationalize this question? We thought, well, let's take NATO, at face value and, focus on how NATO itself is thinking about the promises that it has made in terms of its own, politically agreed statements, and trying to understand what are the issue areas that the organization has promised that we're going to see adaptation in. So we pull those from the actual NATO climate change and security action plan that I was referencing earlier. Go ahead, thank you. So our argument that we put forward in this paper is that the broader motivation, I think, is more obvious, which is that domestic publics really care about this issue, particularly young people really care a lot about climate change and how it's affecting their future. And so this pressure that's been happening has motivated the move towards prioritizing climate change. We know that, of course, the 2014 issue also helped to elevate these discussions about energy security and how different militaries, and can kind of become less reliant on fossil fuels, particularly thinking about the role that Russia has on, the European economy. And so what we argue is that, maybe the types of adaptation that we are seeing are actually more related to NATO's core identity, which is ultimately about collective defense. And so we developed this argument in the paper about how collective defense is really the central objective of NATO. NATO has these kind of three core tasks, they call them core tasks, but they're really like kind of missions or big, broad goals. And the second one is about crisis management, so managing crises. That one has to do more with operations. Thank you. The third one is about cooperative security and has to do more with partnerships. And there's a lot of space in cooperative security for militaries to work together and for governments to work together on security issues. So what we argue is that because this defense-centered identity is so core and so central to NATO's entire identity, then perhaps the types of adaptation we're seeing are going to be those that are least threatening to that core identity. So the types of adaptations we should see are probably the ones that are more on the margins, so we can see kind of movement and change in the cooperative security area, but anything that looks like it might have to do with risking, deterrence, right, or risking collective defense, we're probably least likely to see movement on, because that's so fundamental, right? We don't want to risk anything that's, that might put that in jeopardy. And so we argue that, as this kind of hierarchy is sort of socialized across the organization of core tasks, like I said, we should see more movement in the cooperative security on the margins. Go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. I'm not going to go through, all of these different competing hypotheses. But some of them are maybe more standard in the literature, thinking about perhaps it's really just a hegemonic stability type argument, that perhaps adaptation has nothing to do with what I just said, and it has more to do with the fact that the US is the dominant player in NATO. Another alternative explanation, maybe it has to do with the fact that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has forced folks to think more about energy security. So what we've done is we've interviewed 62 elites across the alliance so far, primarily from the defense ministries and the foreign ministries, as well as the missions themselves at NATO, to try to get a sense of what's actually happening, while recognizing that NATO is a little bit still early in the game. Go ahead. And what we found was interesting. We found some support for this hypothesis. Most of the issue areas, these are all issue areas that NATO itself had identified as the issue areas that it's promising to adapt on. And we saw the least movement in terms of assets and installations, which is very worrisome, I think, because, when we talk about the flooding and the naval bases, but kind of, a lot of resistance from defense ministries, but then more movement on disaster response, on resilience, not as much movement on operational planning. And the caveat to that is we still haven't gone out and actually talked to some of the operational planners, but from the many people that we have talked to who work with them, that's what we're seeing so far. Go ahead to the next slide. So like I said, we see support for this, again, with the asterisk that this is preliminary findings. Thank you. No action related to climate change can compromise our ability to defend and deter. We kept hearing this message over and over again because, like we said, we really think, collective defense is that's what NATO's bread and butter is. That's what holds the alliance together. And go ahead to the next one. On this hegemonic stability, we were actually kind of surprised we didn't see as much. We did see, when we asked the question of who are the champions, who are we didn't want to call them spoilers, but who are the allies that are a little more resistant. Yes, the US was one of the biggest champions, but people were specifically saying that it wasn't necessarily the driver of adaptation. Go ahead to the next one. On this question, is Ukraine, acting as this shock that's maybe moving things? And we did see, yes, there was increased interest, kind of political interest in energy security, but not as much change, which the type of adaptations we were interested in was actual changes to policies and practices and processes. Okay, next one. Resource-based, we didn't see much argument maybe that has to do with the budget. Go ahead to the next one. Go ahead to the next one. And I can come back, if you want to talk in Q&A. But yeah, just I think to summarize, some of our findings, we did find support for this. And I would just say that one of the the biggest contributions we thought was making to this was really starting to think about the practical aspects of how our international organizations, for us we're focusing on NATO, but how is NATO really starting to carry out these promises that we see these high-level politicians keep making. And then the empirical evidence, I think, will be really rich as well, because at the end we'll be able to put that up in a public qualitative database so that folks like you can read some of these interviews themselves. Okay, thank you so much, and I look forward to any of your feedback as we work on this paper.
But I don't know if Will received it. I sent the email. It's not going to be an overly useful PowerPoint. It's mostly just to keep me on time. It's an outline for me. But yeah, thanks to Will and Sarah for organizing and for the invitation to participate. My name is Scott Watson, here from the University of Victoria. I was taken by the title of our panel, which is Climate and Security in a Changing World Order. And I'm not sure about the decision to include the words changing world order, but for me, this is where my work focuses. And it begs the question in terms of what do we mean by change and what do we mean by a world order? On the one hand, I think the title of the panel suggests the international order is changing perhaps in terms of distribution of power, and this is concerning. But at the same time, I think we all recognize that to actually deal with the problem of climate change requires fundamental changes in human societies and how we order our societies. So at once it evokes both concerns that the world is changing, distribution of power is changing, maybe in a way that makes us nervous. At the same time, maybe the world is not changing enough or quickly enough to actually address the threat of climate change. And so this is where my work focuses, mostly through disasters. It's very simplistic here. My work focuses on international disaster regime and responses, either in the form of disaster relief or in the disaster risk reduction framework. Noting, of course, that the connection between climate change and security is between climate change and disaster is very complicated. It's not a direct causal relationship. In fact, I caution very strongly against overly causal claims about that connection. And I'll get into why shortly. And the connection between disaster and security is a complex causal claim as well. We see it in the literature. It's basically through three different formats. The first is the way in which disasters produce mass displacement and migration. Again, depending on which studies you read or which academics you follow, the potential numbers of people on the move as a result of climate change can vary from sort of the alarmist numbers in terms of millions of people will cross borders to more conservative estimates that, in fact, most people will just move internally and the actual impact on international migration will be not overly acute. But this is one of the areas in which disasters can lead to insecurity, or it can change resource distribution. Will had talked earlier about resource scarcity and that early literature on environmental security and the way in which access to resources will necessarily renew conflicts or produce new conflicts. And so we see this in the case of disasters, either slow onset or quick onset disasters, how they can radically change access to basic resources that human communities need to survive. And of course, the impact, and the impact on exacerbating conflict, right? Where disasters may lead to certain groups sort of renewing hostilities with others or changing the distribution of power between groups that will lead to renewed conflicts. But again, I would emphasize in my work that we need to be careful about the causal claims, especially with relation to disaster, right? And now we have this emerging literature showing that, in fact, we often see political elites making the claim that certain disasters were caused by climate change, so they don't have to accept responsibility for how local and national policies are, in fact, more significant or just as significant in accounting for these disasters. To take Canada as a great example, the wildfires that most of us here in Canada are familiar with over the last couple of years, of course, climate change is contributing. Yet at the same time, I don't think we should allow politicians off the hook by simply suggesting that this is climate change and beyond the control of the Canadian or BC governments, that the wildfires are the product of many policies, including forest management policies and our choices of fire suppression, choices of what we use these resources for, private property, the lumber industry. So there's all kinds of local and national policies that have contributed to those wildfires. So is climate change exacerbating? For sure. But at the same time, we can't allow these simply to be climate change produce the wildfires as though there's no intermediation with local and national policies. Now, disasters for me are important because they expose tensions in underlying social order. Right? They demonstrate the ways in which the existing policies and practices fail to deliver on their promises of predictability and stability in normal routines. Right? This is what disasters are. They disrupt normal activities. And so many societies, of course, have developed policies and institutions that deal with disasters. NATO, of course, is one of them. As Dr. Hart noted, while NATO hasn't addressed climate or didn't really deal with climate change until the early 2020s, it had developed a very sophisticated disaster response capability through the 1970s, 80s, especially up into the 90s and 2000s. Partially as, at the end of the Cold War, as it sought to sort of find a new mission for NATO when it assumed there was no larger geopolitical threat, disaster response became one of its primary goals. And I think Will has written on this as well, how the military is heavily invested and involved in disaster relief. Maybe not appropriately, maybe it's not the right institution, but it clearly is. Largely because it's the only organization that has the capacity in many disaster contexts to provide relief material and personnel. Like if you're looking at a disaster, say an earthquake or something, it's usually the military that has the capacity to get there most quickly. So it's unlikely we're going to see the military institutions withdraw from that. But my basic argument, we can move forward, is that we need to understand its impact on international order. Right? And here I argue that we need a far more complex understanding of what we mean by an international order. We typically hear of it in terms of a rules-based international order, or the threat to liberal international order, or American-led international order, all of which I suggest are an impoverished view of the foundational premises of our international order. And of course, it requires us to think, what do we actually mean by a changing international order? If we're serious about addressing the threat of climate change, what are the foundational premises that need to change to address that threat? Right? And how does that interact with sort of the geopolitical context, which we often use as the defining feature of an international order? I suggest that's not the case. In fact, there's many features of international order that are implicated in climate change itself. So, it's a complex, heterogeneous order based on relations, I suggest, between nature and humans, so how humans treat nature. Right? This is foundational in all of our basic economies and our understanding of that. Between human societies, right? Our responsibility to others, and how we organize politically. Right? The connection or the relation between peoples and states, and of course, between states and states. So you have the multitude of relations that are implicated in international order and our ability to respond to the threat of climate change. And here I note that the relationship between nature and humans that's foundational in our current international order is what I would refer to as a modernist orientation, which understands the natural world as a resource to be exploited to improve the human condition. Although we, of course, have seen change in this over time. You can flip to the next slide. That the change that we've seen, I would argue, from a high modernist conception, if you go back and look at early writings on disasters, where the idea was we need to conquer nature, right? That nature is a threat to humanity, and if we can conquer nature, humans will be better off, to what we might think of as a sustainable version of the relationship between humans and nature, which argues that we can still continue to exploit nature. We just need to do it in a sustainable way so that future generations are able to exploit nature in the same way that we are, right? So it simply means we're not fundamentally changing our relationship with nature. It just means let's make sure our children and our grandchildren can also draw on nature to the same extent that we do and enjoy the same basic standard of living. Now, I think the shift from high modernism to sustainable view of nature is important, but as a foundational shift, I'm not convinced that it is enough of a change to actually address the problem, which is we need to rethink human exploitation of nature. And I don't think sustainable development is sufficiently revolutionary to address the problem of climate change. I then move on to the relationship between what I call nature and states, or really economic liberalism, and this idea that nature is a commodity that can be traded, and the only relevant distinction between a commodity in the international order is price, right? So a commodity produced in one part of the world versus a commodity produced in another part of the world, 5 minutes, the only thing that matters really is price differential. So countries can specialize, or they can take advantage of their ability to grow things more cheaply. But I think this is a very dangerous view of the relationship between nature's commodities and states. Right? We have, of course, I would argue, seen a shift, the move towards local production. Of course, it also comes with this protectionist notion, which is, I think is also rising. But again, it's still based on this idea of nature as a commodity, and the value of the things that we consume needs to move beyond simply price differential, right? That the relationship between what we consume and how it's moved across the world needs to fundamentally change if we want to address the problem of climate change. The third relationship then is between humans and humans. I argue that humanitarianism is the dominant framework. For the most part, when disasters occur, the response is let's provide life-saving assistance in that moment. It's really a sort of a Band-Aid solution. An earthquake happens, let's send relief, let's sort of save people, or if floods happen. We've seen a slight shift towards a human rights orientation, that people have a right to certain protections. And again, I think that move towards a human rights orientation is important, that humanitarianism on its own is insufficient, because it's a voluntary, charitable view of what we owe other humans when they're affected by climate-induced disasters, but we actually have a much richer obligation, a human right, to ensure people are protected from natural hazards. The fourth, of course, is between humans and states. This is the states themselves and how they provide protection. I think we are seeing an increased expectation that states must provide assistance in the aftermath or to prevent disasters, right? Now, this is increasing expectations on states. Right? And we see it in all kinds of different formations. There's obviously the emergency services, fire departments, et cetera, but also governments are expected to backstop insurance policies in the case of home loss. And so the state is being further and further asked to subsidize the cost of and respond to the problems with climate change. Now, I think the state remains instrumental. And so it will continue to play these functions. So the recent change we've seen, which I argue is a shift towards state responsibility to one of resilience, which is the state actually can't help you. The community needs to be resilient. I think there's both positive and negative aspects of that change. The positive aspect is, yeah, communities need to be resilient. There's an over-reliance on the state. But at the same time, we can't let the state off the hook here. And then the last one, I know I'm running out of time, is the relationship between states. Here's the geopolitical, or the realist implications here. And here I worry that we have not seen change, and that the changing distribution of power is really enhancing our focus on sort of a competitive international environment where climate change is really subsumed under great power competition. And we see this in negotiations on climate change, where it really comes down to the national interest and whether international efforts to address climate change will be undermined by states wanting to protect their own interests. So which of these needs to change is basically what I'm asking in this work, so both in the book that I've concluded and in ongoing articles that I'm looking at, to suggest that these foundational premises of international order are changing and we are seeing important change, but that in those 4 previous cases, the changes are not yet sufficiently revolutionary. But the most alarming problem is that the state-to-state relationship, the international, is sort of taking up all the oxygen from all the efforts on these other areas. And as a result, we're not seeing sufficient attention to climate change. Okay, thank you very much for your attention and time.
No, I don't have any. I'm not a PowerPoint guy, sorry. I work with military and they always have PowerPoints. It gets to me all the time. I hate PowerPoints. Yeah. Sorry about that. So, pardon me. Good morning, everyone. First, let me thank my colleague and friend, Professor Will Greaves, and the whole team for organizing this. Very happy to be here. Congrats on the event already. And also, welcome, as president of CSAC, welcome and congratulations to our first fellows. I'm looking forward to hear from you talking later on, I hope. Very happy. And thanks again to Professor Greaves, who has been the leader really behind this fellowship program of ours. And we're hoping to repeat that for the next couple of decades or so. Sorry. And allow me also to say that the next CSAC event is in Montreal on April 8th and 9th. So if you're in the neighborhood or you're interested, go check our website or just come and chat with me or Will or Gabrielle as well, since we'll be having 2 days of talking climate security, and we're also working with the CASCO, the new NATO Center on Climate Change Security. So if you want to also talk to that sort of crowd, there'll be plenty of them around to talk. This morning I actually switched my topic after talking with Will yesterday and learning this morning that Heidi would talk about NATO. So I'm like, okay, I won't talk about the military and NATO. I'm going to fall back on my work on the West African Sahel. So apologies if I stumble a little this morning, since I just basically changed my topic in the last 15 minutes. But that's fine. I've worked on the Sahel for like 25 years, so I should be okay. So I'm coming at this from my work in the Sahel, working on the Sahel and, well, what you used to call actually West Africa before Sahel and before the Malian crisis in 2012. So West Africa, that goes back to my PhD days. And I saw the rise of the sort of climate security or climate change and conflict discourse appearing, I would say in the 2017, 2018. I got really curious about that, and that's how I sort of transition into climate security in several ways. And so my work comes from that background, but also obviously, as it was said in the introduction, my work with NATO, especially the SAS 182 group, where we talk about the Arctic, Eastern Europe, Africa, and also NATO mitigation, military emissions and mitigation efforts. So if we talk about the Sahel, obviously, in the context of a rapidly evolving climate change and security field, Africa has always kind of been used as a place to have case studies to discuss the nexus or the connection between climate change and conflict. And the Sahel, given the context of the last decade or two of a war on terror, has also appeared as a another hot spot for that sort of thing. So to me, the overall, if you will, context of that conversation is the last decade, or at least I'd say since the start of the Malian crisis in 2012, of these two narratives about the Sahel being a hot spot for international terrorism on the one hand, and a little bit later on another hot spot for climate security or climate and conflict nexus sort of research and narrative. And so, as you know, I'm sure there is now an acceptance of sorts that there are serious security consequences of climate change, but there is certainly no consensus or agreement about what that means, whether conceptually in academia or even in practice. And I think the Sahel in this case is very interesting to study to figure out what that means and where that leads. So to summarize very briefly the debate on climate security in the Sahel, it's really binary. It's really those who agree that climate change matters, and that research has come, and I think that's also important, largely from think tanks based in Europe, so the CIPRI of this world. Basically, there's a lot of stuff coming out of that, not only and exclusively, but the most, I would say, of the momentum to talk or use about the Sahel as a case study has come from that sort of European-funded think tanks. And those who have been working, a bit like me, many of my colleagues as well, who do conflict research or international, I used to call my work the international politics of African conflicts, because I work on the line between conflict analysis and international intervention into or conflict management into these conflicts. And so that crowd has been very skeptical. Someone like Tor Benjaminson, for instance, who's known in Sahelian studies for decades, who comes from a political ecology perspective, has been very adamant that climate change does not cause conflict. Why? Because, most of my friends and colleagues and experts like Tor argue that the causes of conflict are really historical. They're grounded in political dynamics, economic, social, name it, right? And so climate change in that sense cannot be a direct consequence or cause, I should say, of conflict. And so what I've been trying to do the last few years, not so much to bridge that conversation. I don't think there's a bridge to be made there, because both sides are sort of right and wrong, in the sense that Tor and my colleagues who are very skeptical about climate security have really good reasons to be skeptical, and get into that in a moment. On the other hand, all that crowd from the climate change and security perspective often come into the Sahel not knowing a clue about what's going on in the Sahel, having no local or regional or conflict, sometimes even, or country or expertise. So I have no idea. They just bring in their discourse about climate change and sort of put it on that case study, thinking that somehow numbers or quantitative methods or just very large, vague claims about climate change and security should be accepted. So what am I trying to do, for instance? I think it's really about reframing the very question. It's really the challenge from an academic perspective, certainly, is to try to grasp everything at once. And by that I mean three things. One, the history or historical legacies of environmental interventionism in the Sahel, but also development and military intervention in the Sahel. So yes, there is a colonial legacy there, but there's also a post-independence, post-1960 legacy here that I'll talk about briefly in a moment. So that's the first thing that you need to grasp. Intertwined with that is the current moment, what I call the pragmatic politics, or politics of pragmatic conflict management in the Sahel. And for those of us who work on the Sahel, we know the last 2 years have been incredibly volatile. I was talking with Gabrielle about that yesterday. We don't know what's going on. No one really knows. And third, obviously, the uncertainties of climate change, so the future. So past, present, and future, if you want to put it that way. So there's a need, there's a need to engage with these sort of three temporal dynamics. So let me first start with the present, the current moment of What could say also, I'm working right now with the concept of polycrisis. You've probably heard of it. Multiple crises intertwining and complexity and that sort of thing, but I'll leave that aside for a moment. But certainly the history of the conflict in the Sahel right now goes back to what started in Mali in 2012. Obviously, we could go back further, but let's stick with that. So 2012 leads to French counterterrorism or counterinsurgency intervention in 2013, quickly followed by UN peacekeeping mission. All of that went sideways in so many ways. I could spend another hour just on that, but just to say that both missions were literally kicked out by the Malian government in 2022. And since then, Burkina Faso and Niger are more or less followed suit after a series of military coups in the three countries. So French UN personnel are now not welcome in the three countries. Just a few days ago, even the three countries have announced that they're getting out of ECOWAS, their African regional organization. So there is a moment here not only of the 2012 civil war / war on terror conflict, but now a sort of, I don't know how to call it, Gabrielle and I, again, we could argue about that. So the moment of multiple coups, with a form of nationalist populism going on right now, where especially the Malian government calls in also Russia to the rescue. So it's really complicated right now. It's a big mess, especially in the last 2 years. So that's the current moment. The past moment, if you will, the history of climate or environmental intervention, you've preferred in the Sahel, here is also very deep. It goes back to colonization, where what was used to being called the desiccation theory, or what we call these days desertification, was used as an argument to take over. Yeah, I know. It's always the same thing, isn't it? Too much to say. So basically, that was an argument to take over land from the people in West Africa, saying you do not use or do your ways of doing land management is not civilized enough, and therefore we're taking over. Okay, I'm going very quickly here, but that sort of theory of desiccation was transformed in the 60s and 70s into the desertification theory, and was institutionalized actually through a UN mechanism. So the UN a conference on desertification in 1977, after the droughts, the really dramatic droughts in the Sahel in the 70s, and in 1994 with the UN Convention to combat desertification. And that institutionalization is despite the science that says the concept itself of desertification is not really useful to understand environmental transformation in the Sahel. And so all that leads me to talk very briefly about the future, which is that of climate change, obviously in the context that gets us to this climate change and security moment. All right, let me try in the 3-4 minutes I have left to talk briefly about what that means very concretely. I was in the Sahel last May, end of May, early June, where I followed the Dakar research team based, a Dakar-based research team going through Bamako in Mali, Ouagadougou in Burkina, and Niamey in Niger. And basically they're working, they call CGR, it's a big international organization, some of you know it. And so they're selling more or less, or trying to find partners to do climate security, and in this case related to food security and migration issues. And so we met with NGOs, government people, UN people, all sorts of people in the 3 cities. So very briefly, I guess 4 points that I want to bring up to maybe point out what it actually means concretely right now if we're talking about climate security in the field and how people are trying to implement it or achieve it. So one, as far as I'm concerned, everywhere we went, there is a big gap in terms of climate change knowledge. The level of knowledge in terms of what climate change actually is, as far as I'm concerned, is very low. So people fall back on cliches, on very well-known narratives for those of us who work on this, especially the scarcity issue. So climate change leads to droughts, leads to resource scarcity, leads to migration and/or/slash conflict. Migration, conflict depends on who you're talking about, but really it's a causal chain that people just fall back to talk about climate change. In terms of UN personnel, it's a bit more subtle, but they will say that there is a lack of data, a lack of knowledge. What does that mean for us to consider climate change? But, as one put it, the climate change is now the new catechism or the new dogma. Okay, so it's coming. I like to think I certainly saw the wave of climate change coming and infiltrating in several ways all these development and humanitarian actors we're talking to. Second point, the temporal challenge, because obviously this reflects the people we were talking to, so basically development humanitarian actors. They're working, especially in the Sahel these days, with limited resources, limited staff, always basically dealing with emergencies, urgent situations. So it's a daily thing. It's about saving lives, always running around basically. So how are they supposed to plan, strategize, and think about the long term? To them, it's a very, very big challenge. Third point, obviously, the local regional context of what I call the climate of counterinsurgency. So a context of a decade of a war on terror that has led nowhere, and arguably, and I would make that point, to making things worse. So there's definitely from local, especially if you talk to NGOs, for instance, local researchers, or some are scared for resource extraction. So they don't like white people coming in and talking about climate change because they think it's just another reason to intervene or just extract resources from them or knowledge from them. So that's the moment of the anti-Western sort of populism I was referring to earlier. And there is some truth to that. If you talk to climate change with Europeans, their main concern is usually migration to Europe. And if you talk to American, how climate change will cause more terrorist recruitment or terrorism per se. So having said that, and I don't know where that's leading, I was a bit surprised to learn about that last November. There is the Bamako Declaration on Climate Security. So with UNDP, several Sahel governments got together to declare that they need to cooperate in climate security. But I don't know or have any more details on that. And finally, in terms of funding dynamics, I think it's really something that probably needs to be dig into. Is climate change coming in? I mean, certainly for a lot of NGOs in particular, it was very clear that to them they needed to now take that box for their next funding round. So it was just a budget issue, a financial issue that they needed to adapt to. But in terms of, especially a region like this where there is donor fatigue already after over a decade of trying to solve a conflict or manage a conflict, will climate change bring new money, or money will be directed elsewhere? So in some ways here, I like to think in terms of the different agendas between sustainability, resilience, and thriving, or what people call development. So how you trying just to make people survive again, or let them die, or make them have, or help them have a better life. So in conclusion, I would just say two quick things. As far as I'm concerned, climate change to me changes everything, but not everything is about climate change. I think that's important. This distinction needs to be made, especially in a place like the Sahel, where, thinking 30 years down the road, well, you're into a decade-long war, basically. It makes no sense to them, or it's irrelevant for many people. But it has consequences for also our government institutions and so on and so forth. And the second, especially for academics and researchers, the challenge, I've written a little bit about that, and that's the different mechanism that Sarah mentioned earlier that we're trying to figure out, is that we need to start working on the future. And obviously for academics, especially in social sciences, that's really complicated because our tools are really forensic tools. We work with past data about what happened yesterday, but really climate change is about building, I think you'll agree, a better world tomorrow. But obviously that comes with all sorts of methodological, philosophical, conceptual issues and problems. But certainly I think that shouldn't mean we shouldn't try to address that challenge. Thank you very much.
Perfect setup. Thank you so much.
It was all time.
Excellent. All right. Okay. No worries. While you're doing that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much to Professor Charbonneau. That was a perfect setup. As far as I'm concerned, social scientists need to not be so afraid of methodological errors. The hell with it, just jump in there. Do what you're going to do, and we'll see. We'll shake it out later. But we can't be afraid that we might be transgressing some methodological problem that we've invented for ourselves and shying away from dealing with the big issues. So while this is coming up, I wanted to talk briefly about geoengineering as a security threat in and of itself. I got interested some time ago in climate manipulation technologies called geoengineering. And this was fascinating to me because I had always been looking at the intersection between climate change and state sovereignty. And how do you constrain a sovereign state? But you don't constrain a sovereign state under our current definition of sovereignty, which means that's what's going to have to change. So I'm willing to look into the future. I want to see what we can know and how we can set up future norms for governance and action. So I'm going to talk today about geoengineering and ecological realism. Okay, is there a way I do that or you do that? I can do it. Give me the next one. Oh, wow, cool. Okay. So I want to talk about what geoengineering is. Has anybody heard of this already? Has anybody heard of okay, good, about half the room, excellent. Geoengineering is kind of frightening when you think about it. This is climate manipulation technology at a planetary scale. And there's various ways to do this. There's ways to do it by sucking CO2 and other greenhouse gases directly out of the air called carbon capture. There's pros and cons to this type of technology, but the main con is that it takes a very long time to feel any effect, decades potentially. The pros are that we know how to do this roughly, and that it's ecologically not as risky. The other way to conduct geoengineering on a planetary scale is called solar radiation management, or SRM, or solar geo. And this, in effect, is blocking sunlight out of the atmosphere before it has a chance to reach the Earth. It's like an artificial volcanic eruption without the volcano. It works very fast, can cool the planet noticeably in the course of less than a year. But it is very risky ecologically, and as I'm coming to understand, much riskier from a political and security standpoint. As we conceive of climate change as a security multiplier, we are going to see more and more states seizing on the idea of climate manipulation technologies as the weapon with which to combat that threat, because that's how we think of security, in terms of defending our discrete territories. States are actively developing these technologies now. They're very interested in this, and they're getting money from universities, from foundations, government agencies, international governmental organizations are putting money into this currently. And some of them need access to the global commons in order to work. And I've listed some of these technologies here for you. Anything that requires access to the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, or the high seas is going to be hopefully governed under international law. But it won't be governed right now because we don't have any legal regime that deals specifically with geoengineering. Every type of law we have to deal with this is only dealing with it on the margins or tangentially. And I've listed a couple here of my favorite sensational headlines, which I hope the people in the back can see, because the more this makes its way into the public discourse, the more you're going to see fantastical stuff coming out in various press avenues, planet hacking, Snowpiercer-esque, Mad Scientist ScopeX extinction scheme. I actually saw that one. And my favorite one, Bill Gates blots out the sun. So the Gates Foundation has given money to some solar geoengineering research here. Bill Gates blots out the sun. Technically true, I suppose, but we're not really worried about Bill Gates blocking out the sun. Commons-based geoengineering, or CBG, as I mentioned, are the ones that require access to the global commons. What on earth do we have to restrain this? If a sovereign state wanted to do this, what sort of international laws or norms do we have to fall back on that would allow us to govern this in some way? Well, I looked at environmental laws, and there are some that touch on this only tangentially. The London Dumping Convention, for example, LURTAP. There's a few that say, well, you can't do this with this pollutant, and you can't access this part of the commons without it being for the general good of humankind, so on and so forth. None of this is helpful. You don't make a law to do something you can't do. but now we can do it. So I looked at the laws of war from a security perspective. What do we have to govern these kinds of climate manipulation technologies? Well, I can only come up with two, and they're related, but not very helpful. Number one, the ENMOD, Environmental Modification Convention, which says you can't modify the environment with any hostile intent. What is hostile intent? Undefined. The other one was Geneva Protocol number 1, which says you cannot do anything to cause long-lasting, widespread, or severe damage to the environment. All those terms are unadjudicated. So what one country says is long-lasting, another says is not. And in international relations, ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing in any law, norm, convention, or anything else that prevents a state from defending itself. So we get back to this idea of climate change as a threat multiplier, and geoengineering is the weapon that we use to combat this threat. So I started thinking, when was the last time we had to govern in anticipation a global planet-changing technology? And I came up with atomic weapons. In 1946, Bernard Baruch, a financier friend of Harry Truman's, took a plan to the brand new United Nations, which he eponymously called the Baruch Plan. And the proposal was to put all atomic weapons, the field of nucleonics, as they called it at the time, to put all this under international control. Every country that had nuclear weapons or was developing them would give them up to the UN, to the international authority, and any other nation that did not have them could not develop them. The UN would control this weapon because they knew if it resulted in a traditional arms race, the devastation would be uncalculable. All right? It failed. It failed in the UN because it needed a unanimous vote. The Soviet Union and Poland abstained. And you can see a picture of Baruch there in the photo. He's in a little circle right there. It looks like he's having a kip in the middle of the negotiations. But there he is. And the scientists, the Americans, and almost every other country that had seen how this worked were in favor of international control. But the Soviets were suspicious. They did not want the Americans to be the only ones with this knowledge, the only ones with a tested, usable weapon. So they abstained, and the procedure failed, and the Atomic Council that was negotiating this disbanded a couple of years later. There was no point in it by then. In 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its own weapon. NATO was formed the same year, and now we're off to the arms race with atomic weapons. And we've patched together a quilt of other bits of law and norms: nuclear taboo, red telephone, non-proliferation treaty, CTBT, and so on. This prevented us from using these. But we still have an arms race. And at one point in the world, we had 70,000 nuclear weapons around the mid-1980s, the height of the Cold War, before the fall of the Soviet Union. What do you do with 70,000 nuclear weapons? The answer is nothing. Now, let's go back to our geoengineering parallel. How do we prevent this from happening? How do we prevent a climate arms race? Well, the same three characteristics that led to the formation of the Baruch Plan also apply to geoengineering. Number one, it's powerful technology. Atomic weapons at the time could devastate a city with one weapon. Now we are talking about mesoscale forces being manipulated. Not that quickly, but still, this is planetary level stuff. So these are weapons unlike we've ever had. Number two, there's no defense and there's no countermeasures. If you were living in a city that had an atomic bomb about to fall on it, there was nothing you could do. Likewise, if a powerful country decides to attempt geoengineering and you live on the other side of the planet, you're still facing the consequences of their decision. You had nothing to do with it. And number three, there's no secrecy. We know now that there were spies in Los Alamos and various other places to try to spread this technology around the world, so one bloc, one country didn't have it. We see the same thing right now. And I'm not suggesting any sinister intent. We see scientists from countries all over the world collaborating on various ways to further geoengineering. Cat is out of the bag now. But there's one significant difference between these two technologies. Nuclear arms control is prohibitive norms. We must not do something. We must not use any of these weapons. Geoengineering and climate are prescriptive norms. We must do something, and that is much harder, normatively, to get a state to commit to doing something when they really don't want to, than to forbid them from doing something they want to do. As I mentioned, the United States Army, the DoD, NATO, they are all interested in these technologies. It's not a matter of if these technologies are going to be used, it's a matter of who, when, and how soon. And the money is already coming in for this. So how do we avoid a climate arms race? Well, We go back to the arms control analogy, and we need to build a Baruch plan for geoengineering. And here's my favorite part. Canada is the best country to lead it. Okay. I mean it. You're chuckling over here, but no, I'm serious. Canada has technological credibility on hydrocarbon production, so it has a certain amount of scientific gravitas that other nations would respect. The Canadian Arctic has been mentioned several times as a potential testing ground for several of these technologies. So it has skin in the game, as it were. And finally, Canada has an excellent international reputation when it comes to the liberal international order and rule and norm building. Imagine if the United States proposed an international authority to govern geoengineering. China and Russia would instantly be suspicious. But Canada is the country to lead the formation of a regime of middle powers to propose this type of regime. We might not get to build this authority now, but we're certainly going to need it in the future. Now, Will, in his opening statement, mentioned the emergence of new worlds, characteristics to be determined. Let me mention a new theory. International relations, like many academic disciplines, clings to its old ideas, and sovereignty is one of those old ideas. But climate change is overriding our understanding of sovereignty. This is predicated on the assumption of territorial integrity. But that's nonsense now. We know this. Environmentally speaking, there's no such thing as discrete territory. Every state is connected to every other state, ecologically, through trade, and through communications now. But we still conceive of our security as discrete military superiority. So the question becomes then, how do we redefine international relations in an era where the nation is taking on new meaning? I would like to propose ecological realism as an up-and-coming theory. Cohen and Nye's concept of complex interdependence, where scholars and statesmen had to consider absolute gains instead of relative gains between nations as more conducive to peace, has worked so far. But it leaves out one key variable, which is the environment. They mention it, and then they kind of drop it in their work. Let's pick it back up again. Complex interdependence is no longer enough. States around the world need to recognize and embrace a more fundamental paradigm shift in international relations. Ecological realism means embracing a new approach to world politics that treats the preservation of the biosphere as a core national security interest and a central objective of national security policy. This is more achievable, I think, than a larger mental reordering of our relations with nature, which I think is going to happen eventually. But this century, we need to focus on what we can do. This doesn't mean getting rid of states. This doesn't mean getting rid of nationalities. It doesn't even necessarily mean getting rid of sovereignty. I think sovereignty is going to get rid of itself. But ecological realism bases its claims not on theories of human nature and so on, but on science, basically that we are doing so much damage to the planet through climate change and other means that we are affecting our own survivability. We fail to take these precautions, such as the Paris Agreement. We fail to take these seriously because everybody's hung up on the free rider problem. We literally can't conceive of international relations in any other way, except sovereign states competing with one another for relative gains. But we all have an interest in survival. And so I've got a couple projects in the works on this idea, but I wanted to put this in front of you all as a discussion point, because we need to think about what it is we're going to be doing as international relations and security practitioners in the future. I know I'm speaking to the converted here, but I have told this to NATO, I have told this to the Army, I have told this to the DoD, and I think I can see a dim light going on in some of their eyes. We'll see where it leads. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters. What I'd like to do now is, of course, open the room up for questions. I highly encourage student questions to begin. And if you could introduce yourself and where you're coming from, that would be lovely. It's a pretty small environment, so it's nice to get to know each other. And also, if someone hates your question, they can bug you after in the coffee break. All right. Yes?
Question for Dr. Charbonneau.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, hi, everybody. My name's Jonas Goldman. I haven't held a mic since stand-up night last week, but Yeah, so question about the Sahel and as it relates to desertification and land management. I think you touched on quite correctly that, a lot of the discourse is like, okay, you'll have Western, knowledge or like decision makers going in. It's like, okay, how do we manage the land in a way that's best for you, but it's very sort of top down, right? And while obviously there's important technologies and tools that could be transferred to, help the Sahel manage the climate crisis, but I guess from your research, are you aware is the local Sahelian view of agricultural self-sufficiency, right? Because obviously transplanting sort of a developed agro-industrial model into the Sahel is probably not ideal or desirable from an emissions perspective or sustainable land use perspective. But what does a Sahelian-based model of agricultural resilience, self-sufficiency look like? And in sort of your view, what tools or technologies could sort of be transferred to achieve that, right? Is it empowering smallholders? Is it land concentration? I know this.
A long time ago, someone thought it was a great idea to introduce rabbits to Australia. There are thousands of examples where we think we know how to improve an environment and we do it and it turns out badly wrong. Isn't the whole point of having some sort of international governance over climate geoengineering to protect against those downside risks? If it was going to work, if it was going to help, then we wouldn't need those international controls. So the point of what you're recommending is to guard against risk.
No, I think we should stay here. It's a fairly small room. If there are, we can do that.
Thank you. You'll be disappointed in my answer, because I don't have an answer per se. Because it goes back to, I keep hearing myself in echoes. It's really disturbing. It's a bit disturbing. Why am I saying this? Because it's the eternal question about what is Africa, what's Africa's place in international relations. There are like big questions behind your questions that scholars have been, both African and non-African, have been asking for years. What is African development within the context of global capitalism, right? To me, at the core of your questions, probably that. And post-independence Africa has always struggled to extract itself from being a base for a lot of resource extraction, obviously. It varies from country to country. Others are doing better, but in Francophone Africa, it's probably the poorest places on earth are found in Francophone Africa. So that talks perhaps also about their Francophone legacies or the French colonial legacy and post-colonial model compared to others. Pardon me. And if you ask that question on the ground to people, you get all sorts of different answers as well. And right now, I don't think there's any vision about what that means to think about land management, or especially in context of climate change, given the sort of very volatile populist politics that we're seeing right now, where there's social fragmentation because of the conflict that started in 2012, but has also much deeper historical roots. What we know, of course, also is that these questions are not exclusively local. I have had issues also with that sort of discussion or presenting the question and answers in terms of West model versus so-called local models, as in there is a limit between Mali, for instance, and the rest of the world. well, you need to consider, for instance, class politics. And by class politics, I mean, I go back to global capitalism. I mean, they are African elites, economic, political, social, who very much benefit from what's been going on forever. That's partly why I think the three countries are surfing on this populist, Mali, Burkina, Niger, I mean, are surfing on this populist wave right now and getting out of ECOWAS. They're sort of saying ECOWAS is just an elite group of corrupted officials that work for the West. And, you know, I think they're wrong, put it that way, but they're also kind of right in the sense that they're liberal elites that are integrated into transnational networks of liberal capitalism, sort of liberal norms and so on and so forth. So if you ask your question, what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is that if you ask a question at the sort of elite level, the model is still very much global capitalism, right? It's very much being integrated into global markets, and then the specific depends on the country. If you go to Côte d'Ivoire, it's not the same answer as Mali or Niger or Ghana or Senegal, and then you go to East Africa, it's a totally different thing as well. But then if you go, you know, beyond the capital cities, for instance, you go to, you know, where people live, for instance. I mean, all they want to do is sometimes just to get enough to survive, and that's where land management here collides these past few years in a way with conflict dynamics, but also changing weather patterns, because the herder, what we hear a lot about in the conflict, the herder-farmer conflicts, is being affected obviously by how environmental change basically affects migration patterns. And by migration patterns here, I mean really how the herders move around in the region. So following basically, quote unquote, the weather. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. It's a very complicated issue because I don't think there's one local, say, model here. But certainly, can the Sahel survive climate change? Let's put it that way. Very simplistically, within the context of global capitalism, I'm personally very skeptical for sure. But what does that mean to extract yourself from global markets? That's always a challenge of trying to figure out a world without capitalism. Like some people are saying, it's easier to imagine the end of the world of the state than capitalism. So.
Sahel in providing like food resiliency, food security, other than say disaster aid in the development model, or should we kind of just?
No, there is. There is, like CGR, for instance, does amazing work. I mean, if you know CGR, for those of you who know CGR, their expertise in agriculture, first and foremost. They've expanded into other areas, especially climate security side, where they're connected to food security, migration, conflict, and stability. But first and foremost, it's agriculture. And so they have deep expertise, and that expertise does not come exclusively from Europe. CGR is funded by Kenyan government, but also World Bank and all sorts of partners. I mean, it's a multi-billion sort of organization, and they have, I think, 16 research centers around the world, and most of those centers is staffed with local people. I mean, like the people I was with were leading a the new climate security focus that they're exploring. So they come from Europe, but they've been hiring and they work, and you know, some of their African colleagues were following us in Bamako and elsewhere. So there is local expertise that way. And I think on the research side, that sort of collaboration between the so-called West and others, or the rest, or whatever you want, or you see these things, I have a hard time drawing lines like that, so I apologize. It's there. It's everywhere. I mean, like I said, when we were talking to all the people that we met, when it came down to people who dealt or worked or had expertise in agriculture, it was very clear that they knew about climate change. They already knew the CGR crowd and how it functioned and so on and so forth. So there is, of course, very positive and mutual beneficial ways of working together. But in the current context, political context, as I was saying, in especially these three countries, Mali, Burkina, and Niger, I think that's really, really, really difficult to foresee in the near future.
Thank you very much.
Actually, I'm not going to use this. I don't need it. I'm just going to bellow. All right, thank you, Michael, for your question. When I spoke about these different types of technologies, it's important to point out, and I didn't want to do a slide on this if I had 10 minutes to talk, but that each of these technologies has technological and economic pros and cons. Money is going into development of these technologies right now and research, but no country can deploy any of this at scale yet. So we have a little time to think about the idea of anticipatory governance. You mentioned rabbits in Australia. Okay, this comes from human hubris. This comes from the idea that we know what to do with it. We can manipulate the ecology and have it come out the way we want to, okay? I don't see that changing in the next 10 or 20 years when these things are going to be worked on. So we have to figure out a way to wrap that into the idea of governance. And if anybody's familiar with the nuclear taboo theory, this is something I've been thinking about, okay? So we have Nina Tannenwald talking about the nuclear taboo. It happened once, twice. It was so horrible, we'd never do it again because it's just taboo. All right. We don't have a first use for geoengineering. Can we build a taboo around it? Probably not. We need to do it a couple of experiments and have them go really wrong before we start to build a taboo. I'd like to avoid that if possible. So each one of these types of technologies comes with ecological risks. To what extent is it tampering with the ecosystem, either short-term or long-term? What can we model for, which we not know what's happened? It comes with economic risks. If I'm making a decision in one place of the world and I'm affecting the living conditions in another country on the other side of the planet, do I owe them any money? If I'm India and I'm trying to protect my own people from a heat wave, but I end up stealing Botswana's rain, do I owe them anything? Is that hostile use? We haven't the answers for any of this stuff. So the idea behind using the Baruch Plan as a template to build an international geoengineering authority that would serve as the clearinghouse for all this is exactly what you mentioned, to mitigate these risks and for somebody to blow the whistle if it looks like it's going to go wrong. Would nations agree to this? Well, now, this is a more complicated political and security question. And this is where ecological realism comes in, ladies and gentlemen. If you recognize climate change as a threat to you, to your nation, your people, and your relationships with surrounding nations, you might be willing to consider a little bit more of a cooperative arrangement. But this is going to take time to get into policymakers' heads. It's going to take time to get into our idea of international affairs and what security means. That change is already happening. When I first started studying environmental security 20 years ago, maybe a little more, that was a crazy idea. The people I talked to thought that was nuts. Climate change and security didn't have anything to do with one another. Now we're all sitting here, nodding our heads, going, of course they do. So it's changing, but slowly. But of course the technology is always out ahead of the policy, which is always out ahead of the institutions. So I'm trying to push from the back here and get the institutions caught up to the technology that we can manipulate. And I'm happy to talk about questions. I don't want to monopolize either, but I'm happy to talk about this later if anybody wants to.
We have time for, I would say, 2 more questions. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Elizabeth, following up on that, you mentioned nations. What about individuals? I'll give you a bit of an example, a small one perhaps, but about a decade ago, some guy had an idea that if he salted the ocean with iron filings, that would increase salmon production. So he got the supply, he rented a ship, and he went up into the Gulf of Alaska and spent a week spreading iron filings around. No consequences or anything. I don't know what studies have been done. I don't think there was anything set up to be able to do this or do decent follow-up studies to see what the impact was. But how do you prevent that when we have individuals now, 2 people in particular, Musk and Bezos, who own rocket ship companies, and they have the possibility to do geoengineering on their own outside of nations as individuals. And there's seemingly no control over this, just as there's next to no control over AI. And it's moving way faster than policymakers can keep up with. So how do we stop individuals from taking this into their own hands?
This is known as the green finger hypothesis. The idea that a Richard Branson or a Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk would just go do this on their own, because of course they think they're acting for the benefit of humankind. They're unconstrained by nationalities and sovereignties and all the things that would pin down a nation, much less electability. that they're just going to go do this because they think that politicians and institutions move too slow. We need to fix the problem now. Okay? Ugh. All right, coming back to the idea of hubris. But how do you constrain this individual? Well, this maybe is where ideas like sovereignty need to be a little bit more flexible. I was at a NATO conference in London for the Allied Command Transformation that Professor Hart brought up in her presentation. And I said, why isn't Starlink a member of NATO? And they all looked at me like I was nuts. I said, well, yes, it's always been states in the past, but that was the past. We're dealing with new threats now. The whole point of strategic foresight is you look ahead. So why don't you have Starlink as a member of NATO since they're providing such critical infrastructure into Ukraine? Well, again, they walked out of it thinking, but we might have to make Elon Musk a member of NATO, or make Elon Musk a member of the UN, or make Tesla a member of the UN. I don't know, pick your company. But the idea that states do certain things that individuals don't do is crumbling. This idea is not as useful as it used to be. So I don't think we constrain them. I think we co-opt them. I think you make their interest the interest of sovereignty and security, or at least stability and security. And if we have to make Starlink a member of NATO, let's do it. But I don't think you constrain them. Not under our current rules. That would require crashing capitalism. We don't appear to, we'd rather crash the ecosystem than crash capitalism. So in this case, we got to jujitsu them into working for us, not against us.
All right, we have time for one quick question, and using my moderator privileges, I would like to highlight student questions. And I know where you're sitting.
Thank you so much. This is such an interesting discussion. My name's Eden. I'm a recent master's student at the University of British Columbia. My question is for Dr. Scott Watson. I found the things you were saying about these relationships in the international order really interesting, and particularly that climate change demands a reconfiguration of these relationships. But in my research, I'm really interested in the efforts to preserve current world order and neoliberalism in particular through addressing climate change. So looking at the Paris Agreement, market mechanisms, sustainable development, as you mentioned. I mean, as you said, this is not a paradigm shift. I would say it's actually a process of digging their heels in. But given that context, what change do these kind of bigger, more transformative movements in global climate governance have? Like, what chance do they actually have in succeeding? I think of my research on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and some of these more radical power shifting initiatives like that. Do they have an opportunity to actually surface in the current order? Thanks.
Great question and a difficult one to address. I think market-based solutions have their place, and I think, well, I'm not overly encouraged by trajectories in Canada, of course, that the main market-based solutions sort of being abandoned. But I think there are ways to use the market towards sustainable development. But I think there has to be more foundational change. And we started this panel with introduction from Indigenous elders. I think Indigenous perspectives on managing the environment will be crucial. And I also think, and Will spoke to the importance of municipalities and local action as a way of transforming and moving beyond. I mean, of course we have to have the global involved, but I think it's going to involve the very local in many contexts. But yeah, market-based solutions have their place. I'm just not overly optimistic in the grand scheme of things that market-based solutions on their own will introduce sufficient change to address the issues. Mostly because I think sort of the capitalist system, which has kind of come up in all three or all four of our presentations, are at the root of some of these problems. And so can it be sufficiently transformed within? I'm not sure. I'm intrigued by Beth's notion that you can co-opt or you can bring market actors in like Musk. But yeah, I remain deeply skeptical. And
let me have a crack at it.
Yeah.
It's my best.
All right, so we're 1 minute over, which is essentially as good as you're going to get, I would say. Thank you so much for our panelists. Thank